Boker Tov, everyone. This is our Taste of Torah, and today I'm going to be talking about our Torah portion this week, Vayeitzei, which tells the story of how our ancestor Jacob, having manipulated his brother probably one too many times, is forced to flee his home and seek refuge among distant relatives after he tricks his father Isaac into giving him the blessing. But the central, pivotal part of our Torah portion is the moment when Jacob, alone in the fields, making his way towards Haran, falls deep asleep with his head on a rock and has a remarkable dream in which God stands beside him and makes a covenant with him in concerning his land and his descendants and his personal protection. As a result of this remarkable dream and that experience, Jacob names this location Beit El, or as we used to say in English, Bethel, the house of God, which is such a peculiar name. There's no house. And in fact, aside from later setting up an altar there by collecting rocks, there's really nothing. It's an empty space. So what are we supposed to take from that? Well, as it turns out, the rabbis have a particular inclination to explore these kinds of ideas. Why is it this peculiar thing happens? Why is this detail told to us and not another? And one of the things that the rabbis love to do is to name and identify unnamed and unidentified things, whether it be land, where is Bethel? What do we know it as today? Or people. Oftentimes there are anonymous people that appear in the Torah, and eventually the rabbis will say, oh, well, that was so-and-so, and then connect them more deeply to the story. Sometimes we meet elliptical characters that we aren't going to encounter more than once, and the rabbis feel compelled to complete their story. So a classic example of this is the harlot or prostitute in Jericho named Rahav, who helps out the spies and assists the Israelites in conquering her city. And she is promised a home and her family and future security for doing so. Whatever happened to her? Well, according to the rabbis, she's the lucky woman who ends up marrying the hero of the same story, Joshua. So we tie everything neatly together. It's like one of those great Tom Fielding stories where all the random characters all turn out to be related. Anyway, so what we're going to see here is doing the same sort of thing with this piece of space that Jacob is on. So to do what the rabbis want to do, let's go back just a little bit. So Abraham, the most critical piece of property that we see Abraham involved in, he has a couple. He has the cave of Machpelah, which he buys for his deceased wife Sarah, which becomes his first claim upon the land. But just as important as that, probably more important, is the mountain that God instructs him to go to with the intention of sacrificing his son Isaac. And of course, it is called a har, a mountain. And so he ascends there. He almost produces the sacrifice, but ends up being called by an angel of God to stop. Well, this is a very important piece of property, even though it has no name. And not surprisingly, the rabbis identify this as the future location of the temple. And of course, the temple sits upon what we now know as Har Zion, or Har Zion, Mount Zion. And so this is a nice little weaving together, nice little economy. Jacob performs his most dramatic sacrifice there. That becomes the house of God where sacrifices are performed. But the rabbis aren't satisfied with that. When we go next to our next patriarch, which is Isaac, then we have him described as meditating and walking in a field. And so the rabbis say, well, that's the same place where he almost got sacrificed, which sounds crazy. And even more complicated, what does a field have to do with a mountain? They seem to be contradicting each other, right? But we'll come back to that in a moment. But suffice to say, they identify the field in which Isaac walked as the same location as the mountain upon which he almost got sacrificed. I guess he wasn't terribly intimidated by that initial experience. And then the final connection is made right here when Jacob has his dream and he wakes up from it and declares, surely this is Beit El, this is the house of God. Well, now he's sort of completing the cycle. All three patriarchs, according to the rabbis, have now stood on the sacred ground that will be the temple. And the reason he's calling it house is because he has, as part of his dream, the premonition or the vision that in fact a temple or a sacred house to God will be built on this location. So what can we do with that? It's slightly outlandish, as the rabbis often love to be. It's playful, but can we really draw any conclusions from this or any value from this other than that the rabbis would like to wrap up a story in a neat package without any loose ends, sort of like a Hallmark Christmas movie, right, where everything all fits together at the end. There's this. Let's take these three things, these three elements, the mountain, the field, and the house, and let's use them as metaphors. Let's assume that the accounts that we have from the Bible still have some applicability to us. So what does a mountain do for us? A mountain gives us a wide field of vision. From a mountaintop, we can see very far. It's no accident that MLK, Martin Luther King, makes reference to seeing the mountaintop. Of course, he's referring back to Moses, so everything just kind of wraps back upon itself. But the idea that from the mountaintop you can see very far, you can see visionary things, would be, I think, the first lesson. So when we are on the mountaintop, we see far, we see the big picture. We see the world at large. We see possibilities not currently available to us, but could be or will be in the future. So we are reminded that, like Abraham, we should be striving to see the big picture. We should live, at least partially, understanding that we stand at a very high pinnacle and that we want to see the larger picture. That's what Jews do. We think towards the future. What about the field? Well, the field, Isaac's field, becomes the place of production, right? Nobody grows anything on a mountain, even if we get vision from it. So what we need is a nice, pleasant field to plant and produce, which will sustain us. So that symbolically reminds us that we should be engaged in the Jewish activities that enrich us and nourish us and sustain us. Specifically, the rabbis also say that what Isaac was doing out in that field was studying Torah, all right? Another outlandish claim, but maybe this field reminds us that we need to till our native soil. We need to focus not just on the big picture, but on the everyday business of living and being Jews especially. So we have to work at our daily life. We also have to have a sense of vision, which brings us now to Jacob's vision and Beit El, the house of God. If we have those two elements together, the vision and the everyday, and each one of them is dedicated and consecrated to the purpose of bettering ourselves and bettering the world, what we are building is a house of God. What we are doing is creating a house in which both God and we can dwell. Today, we call it Judaism. And so what we eventually arrive at is the idea that standing in the same place, not going anywhere, not having to make any sort of pilgrimage or journey or anything like that, but by being in the same place, by having a sense of vision, by having a sense of mundane responsibility every day to focus on our daily needs, but also our Jewish needs, what we create is a sacred place, a shelter for ourselves and for our God at all times. And so really the rabbinic narrative of identifying all these unidentified places and putting them all together, conglomerating them and making them into one thing, one place, reminds us that wherever we are, whether we're on a journey or we're at home, whether we are young or whether we're old, if we combine all of these qualities together, we create the Jewish house. We create a house of God and a place that will sustain us and our children for the future ahead. So that's my taste of Torah for this week, and I look forward to talking with you next week.